During the pandemic, we have been taking communion using these little Ziploc packets, and they are convenient, and they are emblems, probably in a little bit different form than what we're used to, but they do serve the purpose that we use them for, and that is to take our minds back to the night when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. Obviously, what Jesus used that night probably didn't look anything like this little circular wafer and this prepackaged juice. Maybe it looked something more like bread like this, and maybe a cup like this. We don't know for sure, but these things are so important to Christians. Jesus said when he took the bread, "This is my body," and when he took the cup, he said, "This is my blood." And sometimes these things are referred to as emblems. They symbolize something so important to us as followers of Jesus. And as Jesus talks about his body, he talks about his blood given for us, he invites us into communion with him and with other Christians around the world. And each week we do that. We participate in what we call the Lord's Supper, remembering Jesus, but also proclaiming Jesus. As Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 11:26, as often as we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. I said in the message on Sunday that every symbol has a story and every monument has a message. That is certainly the case with communion. That was also the case for the Israelites in Joshua, as God led them through the Jordan River into a new world, into the promised land. God instructed them to pick up 12 stones from the riverbed, the dry riverbed, where the priests were, where the Ark of the Covenant was. In other words, he told them to pick up stones that represented his presence among them, his deliverance of them. And Joshua arranged those stones. He set them up where they camped in a place called Gilgal. And those stones served as a visible, tangible reminder to all the people of God's power and God's provision, of his deliverance of his people through the river and into this new world, the promised land. But those stones weren't just a monument or a memorial or a symbol for those people, for that generation. There was a story to be told for future generations. And so in the text we looked at in Joshua 4, God tells them through Joshua, when your children ask you, what are those stones? You tell them how God held the waters back and how God delivered his people through the Jordan River on dry land into the promised land. You see, the message behind the monument pointed to God's providence, to God's provision, to his power, and to his deliverance of his people. That is the case with our communion as well. There's a story to be told. There's a story to participate in. Almost like God brought his people through the waters of the Jordan into a new life through Christ and his sacrifice, by him giving his body and his blood. God brings us from a former life, slavery to sin, through the waters of baptism. And really throughout the text, even in Joshua, there are allusions to baptism. God takes us out of this slavery to sin through the waters into a new life, into a new hope, a new identity. We are a new creation. That is a story that we should embrace. It is our story. It's also a story we should tell. We should pass on to the next generation and generations after us. So what are you doing to tell the story of God, of his deliverance, of you, of his people? What are you doing to tell the story of God's power and his provision in our lives? Specifically your life. What is your testimony when it comes to who God is and what he has done and continues to do in your life? How are you telling the next generation? Are you taking advantage of teachable moments? Are you creating teachable moments? Are you looking for opportunities to share your story that highlights God? Because you aren't the main character in your story if you belong to Christ. He is. Are you finding ways to tell that story? As you discuss the message and go through the discussion guide, I hope that's one of the things you'll talk about. Some real practical ways to pass on the story of God's deliverance in your life, to share your testimony. Certainly if you're a parent or a grandparent, but even if you're not, there are others who need to hear that story. And maybe God is positioning you in a place where you can share that story, where you can tell that story. Every sign and every symbol has a story. Every memorial, every monument has a message. When we look at those memorials, when we see those symbols and signs, many times they evoke emotion in us. If you go to the Oklahoma City National Memorial, it will produce emotion in you, an emotional response. And emotion is good, but emotion is not the ultimate response to the story of God's deliverance. It wasn't that way for the Israelites and Joshua. It's not that way for us. Emotion is important, and it is an important part of our story. And certainly as we reflect on Christ dying for us, it should cause us to have an emotional reaction. But there's even a stronger reaction, a more important reaction. You can find that in Psalm 78. Read through that psalm. It talks about the signs and symbols of God and telling the stories of God and why we tell those stories and why we need to hear those stories. Look specifically at verse 7, and I think you'll see the ultimate response to the story of God. Find ways to not only make God's story your story, embrace it, but proclaim it. For as often as we eat the bread and drink the cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.